Can't hear you,
Lynn, we
Lynn.
can't hear you. You
Can't
were
hear
muted.
you.
You have to start again. You're muted. You have to unmute yourself. There you go. Okay.
There we go. Okay now?
Yep.
Sorry. Okay, welcome everybody to this morning's meeting. It's lovely to see you all again. But before we start, I would just like to say on behalf of Abram Events, a huge thank you to everybody who responded to the appeal last week, the Ukraine crisis appeal through WRJR. They have raised, not specifically from you, but overall this week, £2 million, which is phenomenal. But unfortunately, they're saying they need 5 times more of that amount, as indeed do probably all of the charities who are running appeals. It's a terrible, terrible situation, and it just makes everybody's blood run cold. So please, if you haven't supported yet, please do. And just another thing, if you haven't seen Vladimir Zelensky's appeal to the Jewish communities, the global Jewish community, don't remain silent, to the whole world, I would recommend that you do, because it's amazing, it's inspirational, it's humbling, and as I read this morning, it's in the spirit of the Maccabees. He's drawn on the spirit of the Maccabees. Fantastic. So that's all I'm going to say about that. And just now to introduce you to Ian, our speaker today, Ian Lucas. You may remember hearing and seeing Ian last week when he popped up on Ollie Anisfield's talk about him telling us about the films that he makes for the JTV streaming service. But Ian is a historian, an educator, a filmmaker, and an all-round excellent chap, I think. He's an excellent chap with huge experience of Israeli politics, and that's what he's going to talk to us about today. He's well known on the lecture circuit, and he'll be bringing us up to date on the coalition in the Knesset. With the main question, will it survive?
Just the volume.
I'm sure you'll have loads of questions. It's a controversial subject, of loads of questions for Ian. So if you wouldn't mind, please type them into the chat box and we'll deal with them all at the end. He'll be glad to answer the questions that we have at the end. So with no more ado, Ian, the screen is yours.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen if I can.
Okay.
Bear with me.
There
Right, there we go. Everyone hopefully should be able to see the topic of today. Just a word of introduction. When I started preparing this, we were all in a different world, literally in a different world. And every day this presentation changed, literally every day. It's probably be out of date by the time we move on. But what we really need to look at is whether this coalition government will see out its term. That's the theme of what we're going to talk about. But in order to understand that, you really need to understand the Israeli electoral system, which is problematic from its inception. And the first thing that makes it problematic is it's based on proportional representation. Now, if people understand proportional representation, what does that mean? Unlike our system of constitutionally or constituency-based constitution, where the country is broken down into constituents and you vote in your area. In Israel, you vote for a party, and that party gets a percentage of the votes that are cast, enables the number of seats it gets in the Knesset. So it's not even based on the number of people that are eligible to vote. It's based on the number of votes that are cast. That's number one. The second area of problematic, if you like, is the threshold that the parties have to cross in order to get into the Knesset. In the last election, for example, we're going to talk about the 2021 election in a minute, 39 parties ran for office. Only 13 crossed this threshold of 3.25%. This was raised, by the way, from 3% about 3 years ago, and it started off in Ben-Gurion's time at 2.5%. Now, the underlying problem with these two bullet points is that it ensures that no party ever dominates. And it ensures that smaller parties can get representation. And that, when the basic law was put into effect in 1948, was Ben-Gurion's raison d'etre, his DNA. He wanted everybody that had been involved with the Shuv and the infrastructure beforehand to have representation in the Knesset. My view, that's the fundamental mistake in Israeli life, never mind Israeli politics. Because since then, nobody has ever been able to form, I put in inverted commas, a proper government without buying and selling and horse trading. And it's happened from day one, and it happened last year, and we're going to see that in big time of how this coalition came about. The next thing that happens is once the election has taken place, the mandate is allocated by the president. Now, this is where the president has real power. He can decide who's going to have the first attempt at 40 days to try and put a government together. So what does the president do? He calls one by one the leaders of every single party who've crossed the threshold by number of seats, obviously the biggest first and so on, to meet with him, to tell him who they will be voting for to get the mandate. And based on that, he then says, okay, X party have got the ability to form a government, which means they have to have at least 61 seats in the Knesset, or 61 votes through a coalition, obviously, of people who will vote for him to be prime minister. Without that, nothing happens. And then, to add insult to injury, the latest government last year passed a new law called the Norwegian law. It's called the Norwegian law because it's based on something happened in Norway. Chok Norvegi. What is the Chok Norvegi? It allows ministers in the government to be replaced in the Knesset by other people, so they can get on and do their business. In other words, they don't have to sit in the Knesset and listen to all the speeches and do all that kind of nonsense. They can do their work while somebody else from their party, obviously, some of seats, sits in the Knesset. Now, that caused a furore at the outset, because what did it do? It doubled the number of people that were being paid, because the ministers were being paid for being ministers, and now, by the Norwegian law, the members of the Knesset were being paid. Food for thought. The next thing, the only bill that can be turned into a law that can bring the government down, that's a vote of no confidence, is the budget. And that's why you would have read, for people who follow Israeli politics, how much noise was made around trying to pass the budget. And remember, for 2 years, Israel never had a budget. And that's where the problem really was, why the country wasn't functioning. There was no budget, because the budget had never been brought before the Knesset, because Netanyahu knew it wouldn't be passed, and that would bring the government down. And him and Gantz at the time, and we'll come to that in a minute, could never come to an agreement on how the budget should be dealt with. So those are the 4 main areas of problematica. Now, I've given you a picture of the slide of what ballot papers look like in Israel. Now, why have I put it up there? because it's very, 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 very confusing, to put it mildly. Why? So when you go to vote, you go into a very similar kind of area. I go to an area where you vote, and in front of you on a wall like this are little pockets with all these slips in, pitkaot. Now you have to take the slip that represents the party that you're voting for and put it in an envelope and then take it and put it in a box. Right? Unlike us, where you get one piece of paper, you look across and you put an X, you put the X in and you put the piece of paper in the ballot. In Israel, you first of all have to know what letter or letters represent your party. So for example, you'll see on the right-hand side there, Machal, Mem Chet Lamed, for people who don't know Hebrew, that's the Likud one. The Labour one has always been Emet, Aleph Mem Taf. Now, if you look at some of these others, and I especially put these ones there to confuse you. So if you're not sure if your party's got Yud or Yud Zayin, you try and read underneath there. Confusion can happen, and it does. Not on a large scale, obviously, because people that go and vote are, pretty clear. But that's the way the ballot system and the election works. Okay? If you've got any questions, write them down and we can go into them in detail as we go on. I don't want to spend too much time on actually how it works. So, the election on the 23rd of March is the one that now is relevant to the seats in the Knesset. It's elected for a 4-year term, and the next election has to have taken place by the 11th of November, 2025. It can take place beforehand. Most governments do not see out their 4-year term. In fact, it's very seldom that they do, for a whole number of reasons. And we're going to come to those in a minute. But this is the state of the Knesset at the moment. There are 13 parties that crossed the threshold. And this is the breakdown of the seats in the Knesset. Now, if you look carefully, you can see that what I've been saying up to now absolutely comes to fruition. You've got only 2 parties that got double figures. The Likud and Yesh Atid, right? Netanyahu's party and Yair Lapid's party. The rest of them have got 9 and below, and most of them got around to 6, 6, and 4. Now you can see suddenly what happens here. So the election takes place. President Rivlin, Rivlin was the president at the time for the last 5 days, and then his term came to an end. All these things happened at the same time, like the perfect storm. That doesn't matter. He then meets with each of the leaders, there they all are, and he says, right, who are you going to suggest becomes the next prime minister? Now, everything between these parties is being done beforehand. All the horse trading and the negotiations have been taking place even before the election. Because one of the things that also happens in the election, the number of seats, as I said, is broken down by the number of people that vote. So each seat becomes worth, say, 100,000 votes. If your party gets 120,000 votes, those 20,000 extra votes can be allocated to another party that you've made a deal with. And the deals are big and important. So I get 120,000 seats. Like, whoops, what am I going to do with my 20,000? I say to Netanyahu, okay, I'll say to the president, I'll vote for you. What are you going to give me for my 20,000? I'll make you a minister, kind of thing. Okay, that's the kind of horse trading. So it's all taken place beforehand, and everybody tells the president who they are going to suggest. The first person gets 40 days to try and form a government. Now you've seen these. Now for the last election, what happened was the following. All the parties, other than those that were already in this temporary government, had as their slogan, change at any cost. We have to have change. This country has not functioned for 2 years now. There have been 4 elections. Netanyahu has been in power. Now remember, Netanyahu is was the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history. Netanyahu was prime minister in 3 cadentials, in fact, we worked out 5 cadentials, but 3 main terms for 15 years. Ben-Gurion was only in power for 12 years. And people forget that. When I talk about dictatorships, we don't have to go down that road. But there are a lot of dictatorships around the world. Don't get me going on it. So the first slogan was change at any cost. Then, of course, you have to take into account the Netanyahu factor. Netanyahu was a very, very important player in world politics. Whether you supported him or you didn't support him, or you liked him, you didn't like him, was irrelevant. He did many things on the world stage that grabbed world attention. From his presentation of the nuclear secrets of Iran, people will probably remember that big presentation when he showed how he got, in most words, what's going on here, how the secrets of the Iranian nuclear development were got out of Tehran. So Netanyahu had to be sidelined somehow, because everybody believed that without Netanyahu, a government could not be formed. Now, remember, if we sort of went back to the number of seats there, I'll just go back for a second. You'll see that Netanyahu had 30 seats, almost double the party that came second. So he's given the first mandate, knowing that he cannot form a government. They knew he could not put a coalition together. You get to 59, 58 wavering, but 59 possibly, but that would not be enough to form a coalition. There had been 4 elections in 2 years where the results had been almost exactly the same. And in fact, if I show you the results of the election of 1949, it was actually 1949, it's almost the same with different names there, obviously, because of this basis of of proportional representation and the threshold. So March 2021, election due to take place. And what's in the background? A war with Gaza. This wasn't Operation Guardian of the Walls. This was a war. I'm going to come to that in a minute because we have to look at that in serious detail. And in addition to that, there's a guy by the name of Mansour Abbas, who's the leader of an Islamist party called Ra'am, who's now being courted by everybody, because he at the outset said, I'm not interested in ideology. I'm interested in money for the Arab sector of this society that has been neglected for 73 years. I will form a coalition with whoever offers me the best and the most for my Arab communities, initially in the Negev, the Bedouin. His party is really the southern part, the northern part. I don't want to go into detail of how it's structured, but the Bedouin are his main base, and the Islamist of the northern part. But his is an Islamist party to all intents and purposes. Okay, so the war's taking place. It's 11 days that rockets are falling on the whole of Israel. It's the first time for ever that the home front has been bombarded for such a long period. Rockets flew in the Gulf War. People who were there remember that the Israelis had to go into secure rooms and they put tapes around and there were gas masks. That was a whole different ball game, but there weren't intensive 11 days of rockets. And what saved the whole situation, people need to be aware of this because it ties up with what's happening now with the Ukraine and Russia debacle that Israel's having to deal with. I'm going to come to that in a minute. But without the Iron Dome, Israel would not have been able to survive the rockets coming out of Gaza. Fact. And I'm prepared to debate that with anyone, anywhere, anytime. The Iron Dome could not have taken place without American aid and American money and American know-how as well. So when people talk about whether Israel should sit on the fence with regard to America and Russia and Ukraine, there's a problem here. And it's not just about the Jews in America. 11 days, rockets are falling. Now, while this is happening, and by the way, for people who love conspiracy theories, right, there's a great conspiracy theory. Because you know the rocket and the war started with this whole issue of the neighborhood in Sheikh Jarrah, where extreme Israeli right-wing settlers went into an Arab neighborhood, set it off. Someone went onto the Temple Mount, and Hamas had said, we are the protectors of the Palestinians and the Temple Mount, and nobody does what they said they're going to do. Boom, off with the rockets. So, of course, what was the conspiracy theory? Netanyahu, knowing he couldn't form a government, caused this to happen so there wouldn't be, which is nonsense. I don't buy that for 1 minute. Even people like me don't buy it. But what was happening is Naftali Bennett. Now, people need to know who Naftali Bennett really is. I know him well. I've even had chats with him. Hell of a nice guy. He really is a nice guy. Naftali Bennett believes ideologically that Yehuda v'Shomron, what people like me call the occupied territories or the West Bank, are an intrinsic part of Eretz Yisrael, Hashlema, that should never be given back and should never be traded for a two-state solution. That's his ideology in standing on one leg kind of thing. Now, he initially is talking to Netanyahu about a coalition. And there was a strong sense that the coalition, in fact, was going to happen with him and Ayelet Shaked and his Yamina party going within with Likud, and then it all started falling apart for one very, very important reason. He understood, and he rode on this concept as well, of change at any cost. That he was absolutely adamant that Netanyahu could not carry on being prime minister. Why? Because once again, there's always first times in Israel, changes every hour, never mind every week. Netanyahu has now, at this time, been charged with corruption. It's the first time a sitting prime minister, not suspicions, not allegations, these are formal charges of which there will be a trial, which since then obviously been taking place. So Bennett doesn't want to be associated with us. Netanyahu says, I'm the prime minister. Cut a long story short, him as in Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid are very good friends outside of politics. Now, people who've heard me speak before will know, I believe fundamentally, and history's always proven this, that chemistry between leaders is actually very, very important. If people don't get on, it becomes very difficult to make policy, to trust, and so on. So I've always been of that belief. I've also been of belief that one bullet changes history, or one madman sitting in the Kremlin in one day can change history. And Rabin's assassination goes to prove that. So the point I'm trying to make here is that Lapid and Bennett getting on, and they've been talking for weeks beforehand, by the way. Right? This isn't something new. Lapid, who's the genius behind this coalition, says to Bennett, you know what we're going to do? There's only one way we can bring about change, is by bringing these 8 parties into a coalition of which you, Naftali Bennett, will be the first prime minister, and I will be the prime minister that takes over from you halfway through these 4 years. Deal or no deal? Now they talk, and the war's going on in the background, and they're trying to make it. Now you have to look at these parties to understand what this coalition means. Because any politician or historian looks at this would say, you guys are crazy. How can Ra'am, an Islamist party, sit in a coalition with people from Yamina, Naftali Bennett, Ayelet Shaked, who makes Naftali Bennett look like Mother Teresa, by the way, in terms of where she comes from, right? And I don't have to talk about, people remember the election 3 or 4 times where she had this advert for the perfume, great advert. If you haven't seen it, look for that on YouTube sometime, because she's smart. She is one of the smartest politicians in the Knesset, by the way, and she's powerful. We won't go anyway, don't be going on that one. So the first question is, how do you ever think you're going to get an Islamist party sitting with this lot? Number one. Number two, how do you think you're going to get Meretz, a left-wing Zionist party, whose leader is gay with a partner with kids, sitting with Ram, who will chop any gay person's hand off? Or how are you going to get Labour sitting in the same coalition with Avigdor Lieberman, who is going to be the Minister of Finance? He is the Minister of Finance, but in this putting forward the coalition, he's only got one request. I'm the Minister of Finance, otherwise I'm not in. Not only that, but Lieberman's base never changes. The Russian community in Israel, as a generality, votes for Avigdor Lieberman. He will get his 6 or 7 seats every election. The same way as Ra'am and Abbas will get their 4 every election. So they now start horse trading, right? And the horse trading is huge, because Netanyahu beforehand had tempted Ra'am. This is also the absurd thing that happened, because he accused the coalition, when they came up for the vote, of selling the Zionist dream to Islamists, while he had been talking to Mahmoud Abbas before about how much money he was going to pour into the Arab community. So don't get me going on that one. Anyway, so after all the horse trading and all the shouting and screaming, they form a coalition. I should mention one other thing. One of the other accusations against Netanyahu's government was how big it had been and how much money had been spent on ministers, and so they hadn't come to the Norwegian law yet, right? This is still not on the table, Norwegian law. But the opposition had lambasted the fact that Netanyahu's government had 32 ministers in it and sub-ministers, because every time they had a problem, they just gave someone a job. Right? So they would have a minister without portfolio, but he was a minister, so he was happy. He had his car and his security detail and his big, anyway. So this new coalition, which you'll see here a wonderful picture of, has got 32 ministers, no less. Same size, same nonsense. Because every time they have an ideological issue, what do? They kick it into the long grass. Because we are going to run the country and fix it. Change at any cost. So everything about ideology is off the table. We are not going to discuss ideology at all. We're only going to discuss how to make the country run. The budget. And they did all big deals on the budget. They got the budget sorted. Lieberman got his budget. And then, of course, we had COVID on the horizon, or we already had COVID there. And all its problems. I don't want to go into the COVID problems because there were huge problems in Israel about COVID. And for a while, Israel was the trailblazer on how to deal with COVID and the vaccinations. And Israel was the first country, until Israel dropped the ball 7 months ago. And it became a real problem. And COVID in Israel, even today, and I'm sure Naomi will bear witness, and Naomi, who lives out in any other people there, will still bear witness with me that it's not simply over. I mean, it's over here, but that's beside it. Anyway, here's how they form. The government's formed. Everybody's happy. It gets through, right? Because there's 61 people that are in support of it. And here we start the real problem of this talk, the potential ideological crises of this government. Now, this one was not on the presentation until last Thursday. Literally didn't exist. It was then at the bottom of the list. We have to talk about it. Every day, it moved up a bullet point. Until now, it's right at the top of the list. Why is it at the top of the list? Because Israel is in a corner that is almost impossible to see where it's going to go to. Why? The slogan in Israel about dealing with this is, in Hebrew, and I'll translate, it says, Lalechet ben atipot, to tiptoe through the raindrops. What we would say, tiptoeing on eggshells. Why? Israel is at war with Iran, not a secret. Some people might have seen the BBC documentary a few weeks ago. Brilliant one. If you can see it, you should see it. I think it's on iPlayer. It's called The Not So Secret War, Israel's War with Iran. Israel's been bombing Iranian convoys in Syria for the last 2 years every night to stop the transportation of missiles and GPS systems to Hezbollah in the north. We've got over 100,000 missiles ready and pointed at Israel. 100,000, no less. And that's the official figure. Just by the way, just a sidetrack for a moment. Last week, I think it was last week, it might be 10 days ago, the Hezbollah sent up a very small drone, a tiny drone, into the north of Israel. It flew around the north of Israel, over the Kinneret and Tiberias, and people know the area, for 45 minutes. They didn't find it. It was on the news for about 10 minutes, and then it disappeared very quickly. Israel's got a real problem with these drones. I mean, they'll find a solution, no doubt about it, right? But for 45 minutes, this drone flew around the north of Israel and then went back to Hezbollah, never shot it down. So the bombing of these transportations to Hezbollah are critical. They can only take place because the Russians give Israel the green light where they can bomb and where they can't bomb. The Russians have got missile installations in Syria. Syria and Russia are allies, but Israel is given a green light, and Netanyahu will tell you it's because of his relationship with Putin, which also makes one wonder, but nevertheless. So Israel cannot afford, in inverted commas, policy-wise, to alienate the Russians. Because the Russians start sending up anti-aircraft missiles every time the Air Force has to bomb these transports. Not simple. Number two issue. The price of wheat the price of bread, which is made from wheat, is not only going to rocket, it's going to skyrocket in the Middle East and Africa in particular. Why? 80% of Egyptian wheat comes from the Ukraine and Russia. 80%. Now, if people don't get bread, riots start in the street. It's not by chance that the UAE, part of the Abraham Accords, with your name, which is great friend of Israel, Israelis are visiting in the Emirates by the hundreds of thousands, was one of the first countries to support Russia in this Ukraine war. Iran is a close ally of Russia. The Middle East has changed because of this crisis. Never mind just because of the humanitarian issue or the Jewish issue. And there's an issue there with the Jewishness as well, by the way. My wife's very involved in March of the Living, and the Holocaust is all over this house, everywhere writing. She writes the book that people travel with. The Ukrainians have got form. And I'm not scared to say that. Zelensky, all of a sudden's Jewishness, I know someone I was trying to think the other day, who knew him before this crisis. Zelensky wasn't all that proud of his Jewishness when he was a stand-up comedian. So tread carefully. But Israel now is in a really tough situation. That's just the Russians. Now, the flip side of that is Iron Dome and the Americans and the American aid and the American support. I'm not talking about American Jewish support here. I'm talking about American government official support. It wasn't long ago that the Israeli Prime Minister went straight to the houses of Congress, bypassed the president, who was Obama at the time, and gave his address to Congress and said, we don't need the Democrats. Joe Biden, whether he's the most charismatic or the most powerful leader that you want to see leading the West into a crisis like this, has known Netanyahu for 50 years, if not more. And they get on, and they've been friends, and they know each other. Netanyahu is not there anymore. That's why when Bennett met Biden for the first time in the White House, everybody was worrying about how long their private meeting would last. This is why my theory of personal chemistry comes in. So the journalists were outside looking at their stopwatches and counting the time. They were supposed to meet for 30 minutes. They met for 55 minutes, apparently, or even longer. It might even been just over an hour. And everyone was mightily chuffed because it meant that they were getting on like a house on fire and everybody was happy. Until now, when Israel's been holeching through the teapot, walking through the raindrops. Israel didn't come out and condemn Russia's invasion. Israel voted in the UN condemning the resolution, condemning in the United Nations Security Council, condemning Russia, after having explained to the Russians why they had to do it and was it okay to do because we still need to carry on bombing the Iranians. There's all stuff going, and I know nothing, believe me, I know next to nothing about what's going on. But beneath the surface, this is a very, very, very critical issue. And every day it changes. And nobody knows what the end game is here. When you put nuclear troops on alert or your nuclear units on alert, you start getting worried. When Hitler said what he was going to do in the Sudetenland, people want to read history, you can take that statement of Hitler's about the Sudetenland and word for word, you will see the Russian statement, Putin's statement of the Ukraine. This is a rewriting of history. And the liberal democracies of the Western world don't know how to deal with it. And Israel is caught right in the middle. Okay, that's that point. The next point, which is an ideological crisis, a guy by the name of Eli Avidar, that none of you have ever heard of. Maybe Naomi's the only one's ever heard of. Eli Avidar is from the Yesh Atid party, who was a minister without portfolio. He was supposed to be the minister of intelligence, but the other guy didn't resign. I don't want to go into it. It was a whole balagan, as you can imagine. Now, he's always been sitting on the fence saying he won't vote with the government if this, and this doesn't happen. Now, he has resigned, which means that he takes up his seat by the Norwegian law in the Knesset. So he votes now every time something comes up. You understand the complexity here? So when people say Eli Avidar doesn't really count, it counts. It counts for loads and loads of horse trading and pressure and where it's going to go. Now, one of the important things to bear in mind the whole time is that in the Knesset, the government can lose bill after bill, vote after vote after vote, and doesn't resign. The only bill and law that can force the government to resign is the law on the money on as we said before, putting the budget together. And that's not due for another 2 years, because what they did cleverly as well, this coalition, they passed a budget, they passed a double budget for the next 2 years. So the budget's only going to come up for renewal in 2024, which to 2022 and 2023, and then 2021, 2024 has got Lapid. There's a whole other issues. So watch this name Eli Avidar very closely. The next thing, Benny Gantz, the Minister of Defense, was the Ramatkal, the Chief of Staff in his day. He demanded that pensions of high-ranking officers need to be raised substantially. And if the coalition government didn't raise them, he would not vote with the government. Now, understand what this means. The government, the coalition, have got agreements that are signed, almost like the whip, whipping the parties into line. When something comes up that's part of the agreements that they've agreed on, they will all vote for it. Gantz said, But they said, hang on a minute. This pension nonsense of yours was never in part of this agreement. All of a sudden, he said, and he blew up at Meirav Michaeli, and it caused again another furore when he said, I nearly died 10 times, said you can live here. And she went berserk. And that's why the best of the best have to stay in the army, and they have to get the pensions because inflation. So he said, unless you pass this, I will not, or my party will not be voting with the coalition. Fact. And he got up and he stormed out. What do? And only an Israeli solution. They, same way as here, you have first readings, second readings, they go to committees, and then it comes for a vote. They said, okay, what we'll do, we'll take it to a first reading, and then we'll kick it into the long grass there and leave it there for about 2 years. So he doesn't lose face, because now the bill is being discussed, even though it's not being discussed, but it's there and done. Okay. The next big ideological, remember, ideology is not on the table here, supposedly. What's the citizenship law? This is really problematic. The citizenship law was a law that was passed automatically over the last 10 years, stopping Arabs on the West Bank primarily, very few from Gaza, who were married to Israeli Arabs, or were going to marry Israeli Arabs, getting rights, not citizenship. They got all different kinds of rights in Israel. And it was passed automatically over the years. The opposition used to vote for it until Netanyahu was in opposition, and it came up in January. I think it was, I don't know, it might have been, I think it was January. Yeah, a few months ago. Came up for vote. Everybody expecting it to go through automatically. The opposition said, we're voting against. Because this was a real big issue, right? And voting against meant that Mansour Abbas would have a real problem. The parties voting for, like Meretz and Labour, are having an issue because now it's become an ideological issue. Not only that, but Ayelet Shaked has taken she's the Minister of Interior. This is under her banner. So what they hope would just get passed quietly in the background, she has now made it an ideological issue. And it's a real problem. But, you know, with this war going on at the moment, it's also been put on the side. But for me, I think there are two real crises. This is the first one, the illegal settlements. Now, I'm not talking about the legal settlements. I'm talking about the illegal ones. Like a place like Chomesh, you might have heard the name. Now, what's an illegal settlement? There's about 100, 200 crazies. There's no other way to describe these young guys. These are youngsters. They call them the hilltop youth. These are the guys, and they're not just youngsters, some of them in their 20s and 30s, who have been literally undertaking pogroms in Arab villages on the West Bank. There's no other way to describe it. This is also, the last couple of months have been the olive picking season and the olive growing season. And they have gone into the Arab areas where they're picking and chopping down trees, huge riots, taking on the army. Soldiers have been injured. And these guys, there's no other word other than crazy. Now, the right-wing Yamina party, of which you saw before, has 6 seats. And by the way, what I didn't mention, should have mentioned, what's driving a lot of the opposition crazy is that the prime minister is a prime minister who's got 6 seats in the Knesset. The guy who's got 30 seats is the leader of the opposition. Go and explain that. Go and explain that to a person who believes in democracy. Difficult one. Anyway, so these crazies are running around and making what you call facts on the ground. This is Arik Sharon's policy from 100 years ago in real time. The left wing, and I'm not talking about Ram at the moment, forget the Islamist party. Of course, for them, this is, you know, they're not interested in this stuff. And that's why, by the way, Derech Agav, Mansour Abbas got up and made a statement saying that Israel isn't an apartheid state for any of the South Africans there. He said he would describe it somewhere else, but he's not interested in that. He doesn't do ideology. He does what's good for my community. But the left-wing parties, and they're no, I don't even call them left-wing parties, I call them dovish and hawkish. But Meretz and Labour have got a real problem here because they're sitting around a table with people who actually believe that these settlements shouldn't be illegal. They should be legalized. Now, problematic. I'm going to start rushing through now because I know we want to ask questions and I don't want to take up all the time. I don't have to. So I'm going to rush a bit. If I'm rushing or going too fast, you can't hear me because of my accent. I'm too quick. Someone shout stop. There's been a problem around minimum wage. Labour have demanded a raise in minimum wage. Avigdor Lieberman, the Minister of Finance, told him to get stuffed, not raising it. He doesn't care what happened to the independent factories and business people during the COVID crisis. He wasn't going to help. And he came out and said that, and he had to back down very quickly. But he basically said he's not raising the minimum wage, certainly not to the level that they want, because the country can't afford it. So him and Michaeli, Meirav Michaeli, are having a real row. And this is ideological. This isn't just about money. Because remember, Labour is supposedly looking after the workers. But the workers all vote for Netanyahu. They're going to explain that one. And then there's the last one is civil marriage. They made this religious compromise. You know, there's no civil marriage in Israel. If you didn't want to get married with a rabbi or go through the whole religious stuff, you flew to Cyprus. A lot of Israelis went to Cyprus and they got married in Cyprus. So what was the compromise? Yeah, because Horowitz, remember, the leader of Meretz, who's gay and married with children, 2 kids, he has demanded that civil marriage is instituted in Israel. So how do they do an Israeli solution? Civil marriage is implemented where you have to go to an embassy of any foreign country, and there you can get married. You don't have to fly to Cyprus. Work that one out. Okay, so everybody's happy. Then, very quickly, I just want to look at the last thing, and then we're done. I'll go through this quickly. As I've said, personality conflicts are make and break in political situations like this. The fortunate thing here is that Bennett and Lapid, as I said at the outset, are very good friends. Not only that, but this is based on trust. Remember, trust with Netanyahu was broken completely. No one believed that he would give up the prime ministership to Gantz. That's why the whole thing fell apart. No one believed it. Here, there's also people are saying, well, are you going to believe Bennett? Right? Because Bennett's also got form. But they supposedly get on very, very well. These two, Shaked and Michaeli, dislike each other fundamentally. Meirav Michaeli, very interesting person. She's the leader of the Labour Party, right? She's married to one of the top Israeli comedians, also a very satirist, a very good guy. But suddenly, it must be about 3 or 4 months ago, Naftali Bennett made a plea to Israelis not to travel, not to leave the country. It was during the summer, about 6 months ago. I don't even know where we are anymore. 6 months ago. Bennett's wife took their children and went, I think, to the Caribbean. I don't know, they went somewhere, right? Caused a major furore. And then they said, well, are you attacking her because she's a woman? She can't make her own decision. It was only a request. Does she have to do what he says because she's his wife? What about personal example? The country went mad, right? A week later, the Minister of Transport, Meirav Michaeli, gets on a plane and flies to New York. And the country goes mad, totally mad. Nobody knows that she went to take and receive her son from a surrogacy, which nobody knew about. And of course, everyone was then happy, right? They got the son, everyone happy, and she came back to Israel, the mother of her son. Only in Israel could this happen, right? So this is the type of person she is. Ayelet Shaked is the flip side. Now, I strongly recommend, I'm going to be careful my wording here in this new woke environment, and it's being recorded. I'll be assassinated if I say the words I really would use. She made an advert, a political advert, right, around an idea of perfume, right? Because she's a very, very attractive woman, very sexy woman, and she plays on it, right? So between her, never mind the politics here, right? Just her and Michaeli in the same room is a danger. And the other big thing that happens in Israel is everybody always hears what people say on their phones. There are messages leaked from cabinet meetings in real time. Nobody knows how. But they once had a recording of Ayelet Shaked having a go about Lapid in no uncertain terms. And then she had to apologize to him and all 9 yards. I mentioned Horowitz and Mansour Abbas, the LGBTQ and all the fundamental stuff of Meretz. And then finally, Gantz has a fight with everyone. Nobody likes Benny Gantz, but he's very, very important, and he's very powerful, and he's very effective because he was an ex-Ramatkal. So that basically is where it's all about. I just wanted to bring your attention to another project about the videos that we prepare. I was going to show, but we haven't got time for it, maybe later, but that's where the link is. You'll see it when you see it. You can go into it yourself and do it there. And that basically brings me to the end. And now we're open for questions. And there's my email address if anyone wants to get hold of me and tell me I've been talking rubbish for 45 minutes. Hopefully, I'm happy to receive you. Okay, so I'm going to end my share. And now we should be back to everyone seeing everybody.
Ian, my head is reeling. I'm just thinking of them all around a dinner party table. It would not be fun. Well, it might be fun, but not be ideal.
Controversial.
Absolutely. Get some good conversation, or maybe terrible, deadly silence. Who knows? Thank you very much. That was unbelievable. I mean, literally, my head is reeling with the facts. I mean, I don't know. Maybe people here do know a lot of that stuff, but I certainly didn't know. And just before we go for questions, and if you take this time, everybody, to put your questions in the chat box, which would be super. We have plenty to talk about. I'm just going to give a brief ad about next week's meeting, if that's okay. So next week, something completely different. We've got Simon Parkin. Now, it's going to be a great meeting. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And it's going to be our very own contribution to Jewish Book Week, which I hope many of you enjoyed last week. Simon Parkin is going to be talking about his new book, A British Wartime Scandal, 1940 to 1945. The subtitle of this is Jewish Refugees Interned as Nazi Spies. A very interesting topic. Simon's an award-winning author and journalist. He writes for The New Yorker, The Guardian, and The Observer on a regular basis, and he's an accomplished author. I think this is his second book. It may be further, or it may have been third. This particular book has won huge accolades, and it's been called insightful, compelling, and above all, meticulously researched. So we're looking forward to hearing Simon terrifically next week. And as a part of something that's been negotiated, if you're really interested in the book, you can get it at a reduced cost from a booksellers, and the details of that will be told to you next week. So what could be better? A cheaper book, a great presentation. And so log on, don't forget, log on and be there and be part of the cognoscenti. Okay, thanks. Right, questions. I'm gonna have to put my glasses on because I can't read the chat without them. What have we got?
I can see them as well, by the way. So if you'd like me just to look at them and then respond, up to you.
Okay. Sharon in Sweden. She's asking, in what way is it better to have constituencies, as we do in the UK? The parties with the majority of seats have not necessarily won a majority of votes, which is true, and we know that. This happened when Trump won the USA election.
Yeah, I think the American system is very different because they got an electoral college. Let's talk about the UK and Israel. I think we have our own proof in the pudding, if you like. I live in Finchley. I had a choice to vote between Labour, Liberal Democrats, or the Conservatives. Before the election, Jeremy Corbyn's anti-Semitism was running rife. I had a choice of voting locally for a politician who would represent me and what I believe in, doesn't matter what it is at the moment, or voting to stop Jeremy Corbyn coming to power. So it's not simple. It's not just one or the other. And there is no doubt that if the Jewish vote had not, to all intents and purposes, moved away from Labour the way it did, we don't know what the outcome of this election might have been. Because I don't mind if people know how I vote or don't vote. I voted with a closed peg on my nose. And it just proved everything I was scared of came to fruition. Or people now, but it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So the point I'm trying to make, it's not simple. The Germans have also got a proportional representation system, but their threshold is 5%. Even that they say is too low. The crunch here, and I think someone's asked already, what would it take to raise the threshold? Now, this is where the real struggle is, because you can see in whose interests the lower threshold is, the smaller parties. The only way you can get this changed is by changing the basic law in the Knesset. It'd be like Turkey's voting for Christmas, to really make a great analogy. Israel and Turkey's voting for Christmas will really go down well. But there's no way in a million years that Shas and the Haredi parties, even the Arab parties, the smaller ones. Remember, the smaller Arab parties have all joined together to form the Arab list, that 12 there, where Iran broke away. They had 15, 16 seats, the Arab list, when they're all together. Remember, the Arab population of Israel is 20%, right? If you take the Arab percentage of votes out of the general picture for a moment, and you just look at 104 seats, let's say there's 16 Arab seats. Take that out, you've got 104 seats, and then look at the way Jewish Israelis have voted. You'll see a very different picture. You'll see a very hawkish right-wing picture. And that's what really winds Naftali Bennett and the right wing up. So the short answer to that is, I think personally, the only way that change can really come about is when the smaller parties are bought off into the bigger parties. In other words, you somehow get the little parties to go into the bigger parties as a wing of that party. The same as we had our Brexit wing of the Conservatives, if you like.
Yeah, yeah. That
That would be my answer.
That really answers the question, which is further down. What will it take to change the electoral system?
Yeah.
You've answered that, really. Right, thank you. Now, Brenda's asking, do you think the way in which the war will go will help or hinder the coalition? By the war.
If I knew that, I don't know what I'd be. I don't think anybody, it's a really important question, but I don't think anybody knows that. I don't think Putin himself knows that.
No.
I think things have happened in this war that weren't expected. Now, we don't know enough as observers. Honestly, we're seeing it from the outside. What we do see is the destruction, the actual humanitarian catastrophe. You know, these are major European cities. In fact, I've got a friend in South Africa we kept in contact with over the years, and she worked very closely in the ANC. Was in my classes, it doesn't matter. But what she maintained, an amazing point she made, which I don't like very much. She said, for her, up until this war, her concept of refugees was little black kids being held, you know, with their mother, with no food, all skin and bones, and that was refugees. Suddenly, these are refugees who look like her, have lived like her, and one day were living like her. And the next day, they're getting off a bus at the Polish border with a blanket, and the kid's given a stuffed doll toy, and they have to start a life again. So, and that's not showing those people that are left in the Ukraine, families that have had to leave fathers and husbands because they are not allowed. If you're 16 to 65, you cannot, and a male, you cannot leave the country.
That's right.
So from one day, your family's sitting around a table together. The next day, you don't know if you're ever going to see your husband or father again. And it could well happen. I mean, these aren't theoretical things. These are missiles plowing into high-rise buildings and killing thousands of people. What I personally think is going to happen is that NATO is going to have to threaten to take part militarily and see who blinks first. And then we're all in trouble. Or Zelensky is going to have to back down and say the Ukraine is going to become another Switzerland. Because Putin wants to restore Soviet power. I use the word Soviet power advisedly. And let's face it, there's also an issue here. Right? And I'm not going to try and justify anything. Most of us were around in 1962. I remember I was in South Africa, we didn't have television. I remember sitting around a transistor radio, and the BBC, by the way, talking about starting to broadcast on shortwave again, I read an article. But we sat around a radio in South Africa, listening to a broadcast of the Russian ships heading towards Cuba. And I remember my parents, petrified is probably the right word, of whether there would be a nuclear war or not. Nobody knew. Why? Because the Americans would not allow missiles to be based in Cuba. Why should the Russians allow missiles to be based in Poland? Question.
Yes.
That's what the issue is. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know how you want to look at it, Putin has tried to rewrite history, and that's the mistake he made, in my view.
It's very chilling, whatever.
Anyway, that's so I don't know. The short answer is nobody knows how this war is going to affect.
John Scrakey is asking, is the Israeli media as ideologically fragmented as is Israeli politics? Another bit about
Yeah.
this.
Well, that's a really, really important question, because part of Netanyahu's trial is that he was being bribed by Walla, which is a internet site, and the newspaper called Israel Today that was going to be financed by his backers to be a Netanyahu newspaper, literally, almost like Fox News,
Yeah.
but with Netanyahu's name on it, right? Remember, Israel has got a very different kind of media. Because it is so digitally orientated and the country's so young, our concept of media, of television stations like Fox or The Times, are not where these kids get their news. And that's where another danger is, because youngsters get their news from Facebook, Instagram, TikTok now is the big thing. I mean, TikTok even advertised at Twickenham on Saturday. I think people noticed, but behind the one guy, watch rugby, behind the one rugby goal was a TikTok advert that changed the whole time. That's where TikTok is. Anyway. So when you're in your isolated echo chamber, as I call it, right? You're only listening to the news and you're only interacting with people who think and act like you do. And it's problematic.
That's the issue with social media and internet. You get sucked into a rabbit hole.
Yeah. So the effect of a broad media, which we have, I think, more than anybody else, right? Although people will tune in to the BBC and not to Sky News, for example, if they want to watch news. I don't know. But I don't think the media in Israel have the effect, and I'm talking about the old stream media, right? The traditional media, right? Although people will still watch news. I watch Israeli news from here, from London, every night for my, I run this update course, this Israel update weekly. If people want to join, you're welcome to join it. But I have to watch the Israeli news nightly. And it's really interesting that the pundits on the Israeli news, maybe I'm biased, I don't think I'm biased, are so much better than our pundits. It's fascinating to hear an Israeli ex-Air Force minister, Air Force chief, talk about why the 60-kilometer convoy has stopped, as opposed to what I'm hearing between the BBC and Sky News. I'm trying to monitor all of them. It doesn't, it doesn't have the same resonance because Israel is so intimately involved in this. I think that's what the issue is. That how close you are will determine, anyway. That's the short answer.
Sharon has just posted to say that the threshold in Sweden for PR is 4%. So that's quite interesting. And she's also asked if you can put the link I presume, to your film. Can you put it in the chat box? Can you type it in?
Yeah, I'll do that before. I can't multitask, so bear with me while I answer I'm a male. I can't multitask. If I try and do it now, the whole thing will come falling down. Okay. I'll do it afterwards. We'll go there. It'll be part of it. Or just send me an email, by the way. You can see my email.
Okay. Jackie has sent a complimentary chat here saying it was brilliant. Brilliant talk. And he's also, he or she, I don't know. Will Israel find a way to resolve their dilemma, their reliance and relationship on Russia to be able to help Ukraine? What do you think about that?
I don't think Israel has a choice.
Overnight, I'm sure.
Yeah. I think Israel is going to have to come off the fence. And Israel, my view, if I were in the Knesset, which I'm not, as you all know, I would be fighting for Israel to come unequivocally off the fence, not only for humanitarian reasons, but because America is much more important to us than the Russian missiles sitting in Syria. And we don't know what's going to happen with Putin, by the way, right? There might be some rust, under the surface. I think people saw there was one clip where he laid into his chief of intelligence publicly and told him how he was going to speak. And he made the guy feel really small in front of the whole world. If people saw that, if you saw it, it was unbelievable. And this guy, you could see, was petrified of him. The only word I don't know, I'm using it too often, but was scared of him. And he said to him, because he made this thing, I will support. He said, what do you mean you will support? Putin said to him, you either support what we're doing, do you, not you will support. And the guy was, and eventually said, I support. So hopefully, beneath the surface, there are enough people around him who are so scared of him. There's a great BBC series, I don't know if it's a BBC series, a thing called The Rise of the Nazis and Dictators that I watched recently. I saw a recording of what happens when dictators come to power through fear and through mistrust. There are still people there who they can't trust.
Yeah. So
the oligarchs, for example, I mean, Roman Abramovich's daughter, I don't know if you've seen, she put a clip into, or not a clip, she spoke and put a post up into Instagram saying how appalled she was by the horrific scenes that are coming out of the Ukraine. This is Roman Abramovich's daughter. Another oligarch's daughter, I know his name, also came out with an anti-Russian statement. So, hopefully, not a nice thing to say, but maybe someone will assassinate him.
I was going to say someone needs to take a pot shot.
But, I don't see how Israel, but to answer the question, just to come back to about Israel, in my eyes, has to get off the fence and make it clear where the country stands.
We've just got one more question, which is a bit of an observation, not really relating to your talk, but it's a fascinating thing. Is from Mervyn Smith. Is social media encouraging so many to become the equivalent to Joseph Goebbels?
Absolutely. I mean, the power of social media is immense. There's a great documentary by Thoreau. I don't know if you see, it's called America Undercover, I think, or Hidden America. And he's done a three-part series. You must find this if you're interested in this kind of thing, on what's happening with streaming in America and what these youngsters are doing with social media. One of the most frightening clips is he's walking down a main street in, I think it was in Chicago, and a guy's got attached to him a microphone, and he's streaming live about why America needs to be a white, male, supremacist, anti-Semitic, anti-black, anti-everything, make America great. He's got 100,000 people listening to him live, donating in real time for him to either say a message or to play music that they want. And what kind of music did they ask? This little clip that he played or he showed. Nazi German marching music. And the person donated $6. Now, these guys in any previous world would be on the fringe. This would be your fringe crazies.
Yeah.
What I call the crazies running around the hilltops of Israel. These guys would have been on the fringe of the democracy or the democratic or the political element. Trump brought them into the mainstream. And now, not only are they in the mainstream, but they have huge real-time influence on young people. That's where the danger is. Our generation has no influence, believe me. We might vote once every 4 years, how many votes we've got, doesn't matter. But youngsters who are listening to this and are streaming in real time and hear this vitriolic demagoguery, another word for it, that's where the danger of, social media has moved on. It's now about TikTok and live streaming. I mean, the last thing, the amount of money that these kids are making also beggars belief.
It's extraordinary.
You're 17 years old and you show people how to put makeup on. Now, bear with me, the women here. I'm sorry, I don't get it. She is worth $20 million. She's 18. Her younger sister, who's really, really mightily angered by this whole thing, she went and did something else, and she's only making $16 million. She's 16 years old. I don't know what she's doing. But the older one teaches people how to put makeup on in real time.
It's crazy. It's great. The world has truly gone mad.
And just one last comment. And I don't think it's our generation, like our parents' generation, saying, oh, Jesus, what you guys are doing to this new generation is killing the world. The world's a bad place. I remember my father saying, we used to do the Beatles were the big thing in my day, right? And he used to hold his ears and say, what's the world come to? Swinging London, what was it called? The swinging 60s kind of thing, right? And the pull came about, and all the mothers went, "Oy vey," my daughter, God, this isn't the same. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And the reason why it's not the same is because change now is immediate. It happens in real time. Change in our day took a while to kick in, and that's why Margaret Thatcher could take on the miners. And the miners became software developers or found other skills. People being made or losing their jobs now, not so easy because it's immediate. And that's how I would end. Thank you very much.
Ian, thank you
for listening. And I'll try and put this chat thing up. If you bear with me and don't shut me off for a minute.
That has been very, very stimulating. Fantastic. We've got one more. Oh, we've got 2 more questions. Can you answer 2 more questions?
Yeah, I've got plenty. I've got nowhere to go. People have got.
They just popped in now. Rachel is wondering if Israel's huge Levant gas fields could help the West find a way to help Ukraine and not sit on the fence. Any idea?
Yes, is the short answer. Very much so. But it depends on what happens. I'm just trying to bring my stuff up again to put the chat there. Bear with me 1 second. I want to put this thing back on the chat. I can't get there. Oh, let me talk while I can't multitask. The real question is, how does Israel deal with Lebanon? Because part of these oil fields are in conjunction with Lebanon and Egypt. So this is why the Emirates and the Abraham Accords, to use this thing again, became so important, because suddenly there was a chance that these countries, Israel, Lebanon, until everything blew up, and get Hamas out, that was the big thing. But Egypt particularly, that's why I mentioned the wheat, by the way.
Yeah.
Because if there are riots in Egypt, because food prices rocket, that can have a huge effect on the Abraham Accords and Egypt and Israel and even Gaza, as far as that's concerned. So there's no doubt that the gas fields there, and there's a huge amount of gas, right? But the problem, for example, with Germany, German ports have not got any, the ability to accept liquid neutral, NLG it's called, the liquid nitric,
Natural.
something like that. Anyway,
Natural
someone will
gas?
be able to- You can help me with that, Brian. Do you know what it is?
Natural gas.
Say it
Natural.
again.
Natural gas.
Thank you. Yeah. So the Germans had to have this pipeline coming from Russia that they've stopped, because that's the way gas was coming into them. No German port has got the ability to accept big tankers with this natural gas, and that would have to be put in place. So it's not that Israel tomorrow becomes a big supplier of natural gas. In the next couple of years, it can be. But, you know, we have a problem tomorrow.
Yeah.
You know, you've got 1 million refugees already. You've got the second largest country geographically being wasted like Stalingrad and the scorched earth policy was, because that's what Putin is doing. He's not going to send his troops, boots on the ground, into the cities, into Kiev. He's going to surround it, cut electricity off, cut the water off, and in a week, that's it, or just send missiles in. So the short answer is, I don't think it's a short-term answer. I think it's a long-term. I think it's a long-term answer. I think Israel's really got something to do there, and hopefully, you know, it can happen.
The Leon Collins has more or less asked the same question, I think. Any possibility of Biden turning around and supporting Israel's gas supply to Europe? You've probably answered the question, haven't you? So.
Right, let me put this into the chat thing in 1 minute.
Okay.
I've made a copy of the thing. Hopefully it'll work. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so there's the link to the list of the videos. They're basically, they're 7-8 minute video clips. There are 9 of them there. Actually going to be 10. The next one's going up tomorrow, and 11 on what's called myth busting the Israel-Palestine conflict. It's about the myths. Some of them are controversial ones, and the 6 of them, I think, are based on Israel's wars of survival. Now, I don't take a political stand on that. That's about knowledge. My argument with us as a community is that we have failed in educating our Jewish youth about Israel's effect on our identity. That's my passion, if you like. Most kids who don't come from committed families, either Chofshei Kippot or Israeli kids like my kids are walking next week on the 23rd of March from here. You want me to proselytize a little, you know, to prophetize a little bit, right? On the 23rd of March, the universities of the UK campuses are opening up the start of Israel Apartheid Week. Starts on the 23rd of March. And our kids are going to walk into a nightmare, because the Amnesty Report and the BDS movement are scripted perfectly for this. And now this war is going to be seen by the Free Palestine movement. So why does the world make a hell of a fuss about the Ukraine when Israel's doing exactly the same to us in Gaza? That's the story you're going to hear. That's the narrative. And our kids have not got the knowledge to answer that. It scares me no end, unfortunately.
That's true.
Anyway,
that is.
so those videos, that was the raison d'etre behind the videos, short clips, just to get some knowledge that Israel is the only country that existentially is at threat every time someone wakes up in the morning. No one else in the world wakes up, well, now the Ukrainians do, unfortunately, with an existential threat to their existence. Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran have all sworn to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. And don't let people forget that, because it's a real existential threat.
You're right.
Anyway.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I think that was a very thought-provoking and fascinating, controversial meeting. And I'm sure you'll go back to your families and friends and be able to discuss quite a lot of things that you may have learned today. Thank you all. And don't forget next week, Simon Parkin.
Yeah. And if anybody wants to contact me through email, you're welcome, you're welcome to contact.
Thank you, Ian.
Thank you.
That's
Bye-bye.
great. And you'll have John Blasky back next week, I think. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.